So if I'm a single person, okay, if I'm a single person, and if I know that in the economy we have a positive assortative mating, so which means that if I get married with someone, most likely, it will be more likely a highly educated person if I'm a highly educated person. So then it affects my incentives today, say, to invest in human capital, for example, and then it affects the taxation. So here in this world, I think it will be a bit too complicated to at this margin, even though, of course, it's for the purposes of thinking about income taxation of singles and couples. And yes, I address it in the other paper. It's a very good question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If anyone else has another question. Okay, so
I will stop sharing. And it's actually 2:10.
didn't work?
Okay, Chair, let me try
Please
to share.
this screen.
I think I can see it now. Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for the organizers to include our paper in this great session. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm Jinuk Jang. I work at the Federal Reserve Board, and this is a joint work with my colleague, Matt Darst. Since we work at the Fed, the usual disclaimer, this presentation represents the view of my own. It does not represent the views of the Federal Reserve System, the board, or any of its members. So it's about mode limits and market shutdowns. So what do I mean by this? You're looking into the lemons market, like where there's like asymmetric information about the type or the quality of a good or a counterparty. And our research question is, how can a market, despite of having this adverse selection problem, that functions still well during the normal times, but suddenly it just collapses under stress? So that's kind of like these adverse selection still makes the market work, but during the bad times, even if it's like a quite smaller shock than we expected, it could actually lead to quite a bit of the decline. And that's been observed throughout the history and more recent episodes as well, the global financial crisis or even just more minor events. And especially we're interested in the non-exclusive contracts environment, such as like the over-the-counter financial market. Like a lot of the financial markets work as a non-exclusive contract way. You can borrow from a lot of other people at the same time, such as or form a pool of selling out the debt, such as like CLOs, or as you can see from the Archegos case, like hedge funds or family offices have these kind of a liberty to operate in an over-the-counter market without worrying about the exclusivity of whichever contract they're only in. And the literature that kind of tries to do this kind of a phenomenon of the average selection market like collapsing, they usually require quite a bit of model structure or more of a kind of restrictions in the institutional details. So they are a little bit restricted into specific market context or specific like a structure of the market. So what we would like to actually answer is the more simplified version, like can a more general and simple model generate a sudden market collapse when it's just a small change in the underlying conditions. And what we mean by underlying condition is the mode lemons here. It's simply the worst lemons we're thinking about. So these mode lemons like enter the market, and would it generate a market shutdown or not? And mode lemons can come from two different ways. One thing is just kind of like thinking about like subprime mortgage. Then after a while, then a more even worse type of like lemons, like the even worse subprime mortgage borrowers enter the market, and it drives up the default rate. And the other way is kind of like the aggregate shock. Like everyone was still operating okay, but suddenly the COVID crisis happens, and some of the lemons actually became even worse than before, and then that kind of generates this problem. And whether it can actually generate the market shutdown as you observe in the market. There's a long-standing literature. For the sake of time, I'm just gonna skip the literature review, but just wanted to emphasize that our paper or the model is baseline model is based on the Atara Mariotti Celani's most recent paper published in AER this year. So our contribution is first a negative result that we show that the Atara et al. The baseline model does not generate like screening in normal times in the lemons market, and then a complete market breakdown when a small amount of modal lemons enter the market. So their concept of this like entry proofness, their equilibrium concept is quite strong, very robust in a way. So it does not generate like a big kind of a movements in the market. And our second contribution is we actually just kind of like add a little bit of twist, just introducing outside options to the given model. And we show that actually it can obtain the two results we want. And here outside option can mean many different things. It could just mean like, okay, agents can enter another market instead of this. So as an opportunity cost kind of a value way. And the other way is a kind of like a more strict transaction cost. It can be like an entry fee you have to pay to enter the market, or search cost, or legal costs. You have to hire a legal team to sign up the contract and vet that, and things like that. Whichever this additional cost that you have to pay, and then that's the outside options that we go into. So for the sake of time, I'm just gonna do a very kind of graphical, intuitive overview of the literature in our model, and kind of leave the formal model aside. If you're interested, we can kind of talk about it. But I want to emphasize that these graphical overview just kind of give you the intuition. So let's think about Rothschild-Stiglitz, like the very first kind of screening setup, a classical model. So there are, say, two types of agents, I equals 1 or 2, and they differ by how likely they're gonna get into a bad state. That's PI. So P1 is smaller than P2, so 1 is more reliable, 2 is a little less reliable or unreliable. And agents receive endowment of E in the good state and 0 in a bad state. And since agents are risk averse, they want to kind of smooth out these consumptions across E and 0 between bad and good states. So the counterparties are suppliers. These are like risk neutral, big pocket people, and they're competitive. So these firms are a lot of them. And since they're competitive, the only kind of a restriction for them is basically they need to get 0 expected profit. And we assume the single crossing condition holds here. And I think it will be more clear in the graphical sense. So here, the horizontal axis is the good state consumption, XG. A vertical is XB, the bad state consumption. And so E point, this is basically the endowment point. You get E at XG in the good state and 0 at the bad state. And there are two different lines here, right? So the first one, the top one, is the fair cost line for agent 1. So they have less probability of getting a bad state. So the ratio between getting good and bad, good state consumption to bad state consumption is slightly higher. And for agent 2 is much lower because it's more likely they're gonna get to the bad state. So they have to forego a lot of good state consumption to get a little more from the suppliers. And if the suppliers know the true type for each agent, then they will suggest like 2 different contract types for each agent, and they will eventually consume this much. So this is an indifference curve for 1 and the indifference curve for 2. And so they will be happy to just fully spread out, smooth out their consumptions at these points, at the 45-degree line here. Now suppose that there's an asymmetry information. Now they can't tell. So even if the contract was originally designed to just attract only type 1, type 2s would like to also pay lower price, right? So in order to deter them from actually choosing that contract, they actually have to put a limit of quantities. So this is like a quantity restriction. Okay, you can only get to up to this point of consumption smoothing at a lower price. And if you want to go further, you have to actually pay a higher cost. And then agent 2 will be indifferent between the 2 points because they're in the same indifference curve. Now the problem actually arises when the bad types, the type 2, the mass of them are not too large actually, because this is too restrictive for agent 1. So it might be better to actually just lump them all together in one pool and cost a slightly higher price. Agent 1 and 2 both would definitely would like to just go into that direction, into that contract. But the problem is because of the single crossing, there's always going to be this area, this wedge here. So another kind of a firm can deviate and suggest the contract like this one that won't attract agent 2, but only attract agent 1. But since this is slightly lower to the cost line for rate 1, they will make a positive profit. But if this can happen, then the pooling equilibrium cannot sustain. So it will go back to separating, which is dominated by pooling again. And then, so there's no equilibrium. There's a market breakdown in this sense. And this is not so satisfying because like a large amount of lemons rather prevents this kind of a market breakdown. So which is the opposite. So basically we would like to do the opposite kind of a thing, like a small amount of lemons generating the market breakdown. Now we move on to the most recent paper, the Atari et al.'s non-exclusive contracts. So there are two main twists. One thing is now we have n different agents with the mass of mi for each I. Again, single crossing. Now it's the same kind of a CI getting larger for higher type I. But the second twist comes from this non-exclusive contracts. So you can't just restrict the quantity until some point, and then okay, you're done. You can't trade more. Agents can actually go to another contract and then purchase even more from there. There's no like total quantity restriction available here. So if that's true, and because of the single crossing property, whenever agent say 1 thinks buying this contract is good, agent 2, 3, 4, and other agents will also come in and buy that exact same contract as well. So whenever a supplier wants to sell a contract at a price of like this to I, and I participates, the expected cost will be upper tail conditional expected cost, like serving all I and upwards agents and their weighted average of the cost. And we'll kind of like do this given that, and then ask the question of what if we introduce a very bad type, the mode limits in this model. So to start off with, I'm gonna first introduce the consumption possibility frontier here. Now it's not a straight line, and it's not like straight lines like these. So up to say like Q1 point, agent 1 might
5
want.
minutes.
Okay, thank you. Purchase like this much. But the problem is after that, agent 2 can actually purchase even more from there. And then the C2 bar will look like this. If it started off the endowment point, it'll be like starting off over here. And then after that, agent 3 or C3 bar will start after agent 2 is finished purchasing. So it's like this. So to give you the full like description, this looks like this. So for the start off, the C1 bar, whenever it's like a tangential to the indifference curve of 1, then that's the maximized point for agent 1's purchasing optimal quantity decision. So they will stop purchasing anymore, and the market knows that. And the market just anything above that, market will price C2 or C2 bar. And then after some point, it will be tangential to that indifference curve of 2. And then agent 2 stops at that point, which is Q2, and so forth. So that's what's going to look like. So that's a Atari et al. Result. Now let's move on to our result. If we introduce the mode lemons, the first order effect is basically just increases all the prices. So that basically kind of like flattens all the slopes like this. But the second order effect is actually the quantity effect. Now, because it's a much more steeper or higher price, agent 1 would like to purchase a little less than that, the before. Q1 now is, instead of Q1, they just purchase Q1 tilde. So not only it just depresses overall the slope, it also it contracts the quantity. So it's gonna be a rotation in the shape. And it will look like this. But the key here is it's never gonna be like suddenly just collapsing. Like keep on increasing the mass and mode limits. It will just kind of constantly going down in a smooth way. So this is not as what we would like to see. Now let's look into our proposed extension with outside options. Suppose agent 1 can get a gamma level of utility if they actually exit the market. And let's represent that with this dashed indifference curve. So at the beginning, it may be lower than the optimal utility you can get out of the market. So agent 1 is participating. But after the decline, because of the mode elements, the optimal consumption level might be actually below the outside option utility. So they're going to exit. So instead of the usual, like the pink line that we've seen before, now it actually becomes the blue line here. So there's a huge contraction of the quantities. So so agent 2 is the consumption possibility frontier start from here. And then if had it been the agent 1 participated in the market as usual, their utility level might be still above the gamma level, their outside option level. But because of the exit of agent 1, agent 2 optimal utility level will also go down. And then that will also exit as well. So there's going to be a negative spillover of exit of agent 1. And that could cause the exit of agent 2. And that this cascade of exit can keep on happening. And here's a little simulation we show. So this is the case without outside option, the Target-all model. Even though we keep on increasing the multi-lemons mass, like all the agents are still in the market, even though they're consuming much less. But if we introduce the outside option, as you can see, is a much more chunkier movement. And eventually at the mass of 0.3, all markets collapse. Not only the agent 1 through 5, the usual agents exit, but the multi-lemons themselves even exit the market because it's not worth staying in the market anymore.
You have 1 minute.
Okay, great. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. You have the more formal model. Even if we don't have the marginal non-differentiable utility, we can just kind of like do all these arguments and prove that. And why we care about it is like because that kind of justifies why we would like to kind of subsidize these type of markets, especially if it has some kind of a negative spillovers to other markets or the economy in general. And that could be quite not so costly because we only have to like support a little bit to the C1 bar to make them enter the market, and then that will have these like a stepwise spillovers to other agents. So to conclude, our main point is basically models with outside option, they move smoothly because all the quantities decisions depend on marginal utility only. So this concept of entry proofness of the Atari et al. Is very strong and robust, but perhaps too strong. So we can't really have huge like swings in the market unless we have like enormous amount of multi-lemons to enter the market. Our model, we kind of flips that as the outside option. So now not only marginal utility, but the total level of utility actually matters. And once you hit that, that will actually hit this, the exit of an agent actually has a negative spillovers in terms of total utility. So that could trigger this cascade of exits. So small mass of multi-lemons can have a like huge market shutdowns eventually. So this is kind of a simple and general model. So hope it has a lot of insights and applicability to other markets. And so we're working on that as well. Yeah, thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, so who has the first question now? Well, I see nobody, so still I'm gonna ask. I was interested in what you say at the very end, like having a small subsidy to the best types will recreate the whole market. Have you compared it with the cost of just basically having a subsidy to the worst type of people? You know, because your argument here is that there are just a small mass of moldy lemons collapse the market. Why if I'm the government, you know what, you guys are very screwed up, I'm gonna take care of you, and I let the market deal with the rest. You have any sense in which that could be cheaper or more expensive, or have you done any calculation about that?
Oh, that's actually a really good point. So we haven't actually thought about that way, but kind of like my hunch is that that's going to be more costly, mainly because it's the exit of the upper ones that's actually harming the lower ones, not the lower ones like themselves. So like say like the multi-lemons, like they themselves would be just kind of like entering with say with a very high kind of a cost for the suppliers to actually service them. So and because of their entrance their entry, all the other like the higher ones are actually getting suffered by this higher increased cost throughout all the layers, like from Q1, Q2, all the exports. So it will be like cheaper to actually just make sure that agent 1 has enough utility level to actually enter the market and stay there. And that could make agent 2 to get less negative spillovers from the exit of agent 1, and then so forth. So that's going to be like kind of like a compounded kind of effect throughout the whole agents through N. So I think I haven't made a formal calculation or a comparison yet, but my kind of intuition is that I think it's going to be much more cheaper to just support agent 1 rather than agent like N.
And Miguel, please go ahead. Miguel, can you unmute yourself? Oh, yeah.
Hello, hi, thank you. It was very interesting. I was just wondering, when you say that there is an outside option, I was wondering why this outside option, this indifference curve that you draw, doesn't go through the endowment point, the E0. I mean, a priori, I would have the idea that it should go through there because that's the situation without insurance. And I was thinking that maybe one explanation could be that there is like a fixed cost that actually your outside option, your whole consumption set includes a fixed cost, and that's why if you do not incur in that cost in order to buy insurance, you actually have a larger consumption set that actually goes through your initial endowment in that enlarged set. And I was thinking that it might be an explanation of why the gamma utility doesn't go through the endowment point, but maybe I was wondering if I was on the right track on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Rio. And then that's absolutely right. Like you're exactly right. So if like gamma was 0, say, like there is no kind of additional like fixed cost, like there's like a lump sum cost to actually enter the market or to just choose the other market, then without that, that will just go to the endowment point, of course. That's kind of like the indifference curve that will be. But that will be like much more upwards. That kind of represents the difference between the utility level of the two different indifference curves are exactly the gamma we were talking about. And so you're right on point. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I just have one more extra question just following on that, because if I remember correctly, your diagram, everybody's buying the same contract the consumer one is buying, you know? So the consumer one buys up until the red, then the consumer two is supposed to buy the one until the red, and then until the purple, and then keep going. But then you're actually subsidizing everybody, you know?
So there are two. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. So there are
so just for you to keep in mind.
Yeah. So there are two ways to subsidize. Like one thing is just like, okay, whoever buys like C1s, like you're kind of like getting paid more. So that's one way to actually do it. Yeah. So exactly. So that's one way that whoever just gets this much, you just get this much of a subsidy. So you're basically kind of like subsidizing the whole pool. But that's also the kind of like the whole point of like these like CLOs and all these things. Like they just kind of like lump a lot of like these other different levels of like how do I say the reliability, different levels of like the default probability, for example. And then you kind of lump them up and then just kind of like get the best pool out of it, and then you just call it as a AAA. So it's kind of like just basically kind of like this AAA portion, you're just kind of like subsidizing that. So the benefit goes to everyone else. Yes, that's absolutely true. But at the same time, it's just kind of like preventing this additional kind of a spillovers from an exit of agent 1 that's just causing others to kind of get higher price, which will cause the agent 2 to exit. So that this kind of like the spillover, the domino effect will be quite large compared to just kind of like subsidizing all of them to some degree, just to prevent from agent 1 to exit the market. So yeah, in that sense, yeah, you're correct. But still, it could be much more cheaper and desirable than just letting it just all go down.
Okay, thank you, Jung-Wook. I think we are a little bit behind, so without further ado, let's move to Stefano.
Yeah, and make sure my screen. All right, can you all see it and hear me correctly? All right.
Yes.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm very excited to present my research on risk aversion with nothing to lose today. And the motivator shown for this research really comes from reading some literature in finance, because in finance, the predominant theoretical framework to understand the behavior of firms in distress is the risk shifting framework. So the idea that if like a decision maker, like a corporate manager, is close to default, then at that point there is pretty much nothing left to lose. You might as well gamble for resurrection and make risky investments. However, if we look at the empirical evidence, I would say the evidence is mixed at best. There are quite a few established cases in which it's been pretty well documented that when facing a situation of distress, firms actually reduce their risk exposure. So really contradicting the risk shifting paradigm. And so what I'm going to ask in this paper is simply, why do we observe these kind of cases? And the answer I will give is essentially that, well, the real world is dynamic and decision makers face some dynamic trade-offs. So the standard theory of risk shifting really focuses on the short-term benefit of risk shifting. So essentially, if you're lucky, you get something. If you're unlucky, you don't lose anything. But in reality, there might be some long-term considerations that go into the investment decision of firms that might completely alter the predictions of a model. And so what I'm going to do in this paper is to provide you some sufficient conditions under which distressed firms actually reduce risk exposure. And I'm going to show these conditions are very parsimonious models that can be applied to a wide range of scenarios. And then we'll actually look at two specific applications. So we'll look at levered financial institutions. Think about an insurance company, a pension fund, a bank, and an active mutual fund, so an unlevered institution. And then this theory comes with some empirical implications. One about the role of managerial discretion, so we'll look closely about that. So it's important the manager, there's some separation between equity holders and management, and implication about what we should expect in mutual funds when they perform poorly. So, and let's start with a general, very abstract model. So let's think about a state variable. So in the application, this could be the value of the firm's assets or the reputation of a manager. That follows a drift and has some exposure to a Brownian shock. Now, eta will parameterize the exposure to the Brownian shock. That will be a control. Now, I'm allowing that to affect also the drift of the state variable. Then we have a risk neutral decision maker. So think about this as a corporate manager who earns some flow payoff that depends on the value of the state variable and the risk exposure, and chooses that the risk exposure of the firm within an interval in order to maximize its lifetime utilities, like expected cash flow. And then this, this is like essentially like a single person game. In the background, there is some players that's going to stop the game at some point whenever the state variable falls below a threshold. Let's call it Y bar. So this could be like a equity holder decided they want to default when asset values are too low. And at that point, I'm going to normalize the outside option of the decision maker to 0. But this is just a normalization. So now we want to ask, how does the decision maker behave when it's close to this termination threshold, Y bar? And to characterize the behavior of the decision maker, I want to make 2 assumptions. I want to explore 2 conditions. One is that the decision maker earns rents, at least in the long run. And by that, I mean that at the termination threshold, the drift of the state variable is positive. So the state variable tends to move away from termination. And the decision maker earns positive cash flows, while it's non-negative cash flows. And we want at least one straight inequality. And the second condition we're going to impose is essentially saying that the marginal benefit of increasing volatility is not excessive. So we wanted the marginal benefit of increasing volatility both on the drift and on the cash flow is less than twice the average benefit, with at least one straight inequality. Now, this essentially rules out extreme curvature in the effect of a risk exposure. So these conditions may appear quite exotic, but actually, linear functions satisfy these conditions and are pretty natural in a lot of environments. Now, it turns out that once we look at the behavior of the decision maker near the default, the termination threshold, Y bar, it turns out if the first condition holds, so if the decision maker has long-term rents, then the decision maker becomes endogenously risk averse. So this is a risk neutral decision maker, but near the termination threshold, his continuation value becomes concave. So it becomes endogenously risk averse. He dislikes risk. Moreover, if also like the benefits of the risk exposure are not excessive, it turns out that the decision maker wants to minimize risk exposure near the termination threshold. Now, this is like a much stronger result than what we should usually expect, because if the benefits of risk exposure are not excessive, usually we expect an interior solution to the level of risk exposure. Here, the result is much stronger. It's telling us that it doesn't matter how low is the lower bound, the decision maker goes all the way down to the lower bound. So there are no interior solution there. And so, why the title of the paper, Risk Aversion with Nothing to Lose? Well, this is really a special case. So think about a situation in which the flow payoff at termination is exactly 0, and flow payoff may be even convex, both in the state variable and in the risk exposure, and yet we observe no risk shifting. And that's because there is really like a dynamic trade-off that emerges in a dynamic model. Because it's true there's a benefit in increasing risk exposure that may come from the convexity of payoff function near the termination threshold. However, there is a cost here, which is the loss of long-term rents. So the agent here could gamble for resurrection, but by gambling for resurrection is essentially also gambling his entire future possible profits he could earn by staying alive. And so for this kind of result, the dynamics are really crucial. We cannot obtain this kind of result in a simple in a static model, no matter how complicated we want to make it. And so just to make some examples, let's look at a levered financial institution. So here we will have a corporate manager who is going to be our decision maker. The firm assets will be the state variable, and the manager will have to choose the share of risk or safe investments in the firm's portfolio. So here's controlling the risk exposure. And then we have equity holders that decide when they optimally decide when they want to default. So this is essentially like Leland's. This is actually like a Leland's model with a manager choosing risk exposure. So I assume firm's assets evolve as a geometric Brownian motion. Again, both the risk exposure and both the volatility and the drift of risky assets depends on the fraction of both the volatility and the drift of the firm's assets depend on the fraction of risky assets in the portfolio. So these assets generate some cash flow every period of time. But equity holders need to pay some liabilities. So imagine there's some debt outstanding that requires fixed payment of C every period. Again, this could also be a defined benefit pension plan that has to pay retirees C every month. Then the manager, let's assume, is compensated with a fraction of the cash flow. So we can be very flexible about how this measure might be compensated. As long as this measure has limited liability, the results will hold. So let's just assume this measure compensated with a fraction of the cash flow. And then equity holders are the residual claimants. So they receive the cash flow of the firm after paying the liabilities and after paying the manager. And actually, I noticed there is a typo. There shouldn't be this eta right here. So I apologize about that. So here the question would be multiple equilibria depending on what we want to assume about commitment. Let's just keep in the spirit of the Leland model. Let's look at a Markov perfect equilibrium. So an equilibrium in which there is really no commitment. Strategies just depend on asset values. And here the measure will maximize the present value of its future compensation by choosing the risk exposure for the firm. And equity holders decide when to optimally default and walk away from the firm. And at that point, we just assume that the measure will be terminated. So in a Markov perfect equilibrium, there will be a threshold for asset values below which equity holders will decide to default and essentially fire the manager. Now, it turns out that in this model, even if we have an endogenous default decision by equity holders, we're essentially back to the baseline case we discussed at the very beginning. And in fact, if we look near the default threshold optimally chosen by equity holders, it is true that equity holders are risk loving. So their continuation value is convex, so they like risk. For them, default is optimal, but default is not optimal for the manager. And in fact, in this model I just presented to you, the measure does develop some endogenous risk aversion. And on top of that, not only the measure is risk averse, but minimizes the amount of risk exposure near the termination threshold. And just to give you an illustration of the results, on the left, I show you the continuation values of the equity holders and the manager. we see equity holders are concave near termination, the measure is are convex near termination, the measure has a concave continuation values. And on the right, I show you the share of risk investments in the firm's portfolio, that it goes all the way down to the lower bound when we approach the termination threshold. So
5 minutes.
Thank you. So what we learn from this is not just, we should not necessarily expect risk shifting in firms, but for that to happen, managerial discretion is quite key. So here is really key that there's a separation between the manager and the equity holders, and that the manager has some discretion to choose the risk exposure of the firm. And in fact, there is some supporting evidence out there. In fact, it appears that firms tend to take less risk when managers enjoy more control rights, and that in those situations, it appears that managers are willing to sacrifice profitability in order to reduce risk exposure. So again, this is really to highlight that default is optimal for equity holders, but not for the manager. If in the firms, the managers are decision makers, that might drive some endogenous risk aversion in the behavior of firms that we will observe in the data. Now let's change scenario and let's look instead at an unlevered institution. So let's think, for example, of an active mutual fund where the fund manager is the decision maker and the state variable is the reputation of the manager. Now, the manager will decide the level of, let's think of it as activeness, that will decide the volatility of reputation. And in the background, we have investors that will provide capital to the fund unless the reputation of the manager is too low. At that point, we'll withdraw all the money and the manager will be terminated. So this is like a model of like Burke and Green in continuous time with the decision of activeness. So gross returns that produced by the funds are subject to some decrease in return to scale in fund size. Returns are driven by the skill of the manager that is unknown. And let's assume there is some cost of active management that will induce some termination. Now the manager may decide how active to be. And now the role of activeness is really to essentially reveal the skill of the manager in returns. A very active manager will produce very good returns if the manager is skilled, and so returns will be very informative about the manager's skill in that case. And here we're assuming the manager's skill follows a Markov chain. So it switches from 0 to 1. So sometimes the manager has some good ideas, sometimes the manager has bad ideas. But what's really important is that on average, in the long run, the manager is profitable. So in the long run, the manager produces value. So in terms of players, we have this risk neutral fund manager that maximizes lifetime fee revenues and does that by choosing fees and choosing the activeness of the fund. And then we have risk neutral competitive investors supply capital to the fund and in equilibrium after fees that earn zero net alpha. So essentially the fund manager gets all the value added produced by the fund. Now, the key state variable here is reputation, which is formed by observing performance. Now, why is that important? Because that decides the termination of the measure and also the fees the measure earns. So the fund will be terminated when the reputation of the measure is too bad. It's not enough to make up for the cost of active management. But importantly, because the measure is profitable in the long run, reputation is a positive drift near termination. And this will be the source of the long run rents of this manager. And the role of active share the role of activeness here is really to control the volatility of beliefs. The more the fund is active, the more beliefs respond to performance. I will wrap up in a few seconds. Thank you.
You have 1 minute.
Yeah. And then importantly, when the fund is terminated, reputation will stop updating. And so the manager will receive the outside option. Now here, we can solve the math. And what happens is that the fund revenues will be a convex function, both of reputation and active share, using standard parameterization like Burke and Green. Now, there's a lot of empirical research in asset management that says, well, because of the convexity of fee revenues, fund managers should gamble for resurrection after bad performance or when they're near termination. And so I'm asking, well, is that really the case? Should we really expect that? And the answer, as you might expect, is just no. Again, this model falls exactly into that class of models we just described before, And so near termination threshold, the manager is risk averse and minimizes risk. And so just an illustration, we see that the continuation value of the measure is concave near termination, and the measure minimizes activeness near termination. And so this is just like, I would like to put this into perspective when it comes to empirical research in finance, because the risk shifting in active funds is really not obvious, to the point that if you really think of that dynamics are important, and I have an extension of this type on the paper, we should reach the conclusion that overconfident managers would actually try to avoid risk near determination because they believe they have long-term rents, unlike unbiased managers. So let me just conclude by saying that overall, in a dynamic world, risk shifting is not obvious, and so we should expect it under some circumstances, but not under some others. And because with dynamics, we may have endogenous risk aversion arising because of the preservation in an attempt to preserve long-term rents. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So we open the floor for questions. Anybody? Well, if nobody, I have.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Okay. Good to see you again.
Hey, how are you? Good to see you.
Yeah. So I think that this is very fascinating, but I kind of like missed the reason why the managers and equity holders have this kind of wedge between the risk choice. Can you kind of explain more on that?
So what is happening here is that when equity holders default, it's because they are making losses. So equity holders always wait to default until they're pretty deep in red. That doesn't happen for the managers. For the manager, we're assuming limited liability. So the manager keeps receiving non-negative cash flows for the firm, while equity holders keep making losses from this firm. And so at some point, losses are too much for equity holders, and they say, okay, I default. But the manager with limited liability, like for the manager, default is never optimal. And so this drives this difference in risk preferences. Equity holders are happy to give up the firm, the manager is not.
I see. Makes sense. Thank you. And maybe I can ask one more question. I'm sorry.
But, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Juan. While I'm at it, so you mentioned like the dynamic is like a crucial, but like isn't it also possible like you're using like continuous time right now? So like of course like the discount factor is like super like large or small, whichever direction it is. I mean like close to 1, say. But like if it is like a more chunky like discrete time dynamics, like wouldn't it be possible with depending on the discount factor, this does not actually come into play?
Let me think for a second. Possible.
Yeah, it's kind of like a reputation or repeated games literature that like there's like a minimum, like a lower bound for the discount factor to make these kind of a long. This is kind of like a long run threat, right?
Yeah.
Work. Yeah.
No, yeah,
but it makes sense for the
possible.
stochastic at the calculus setting. I mean, continuous time setting.
Let me think for a second. Although I'm not. It might depend though, honestly, because I'm not entirely sure, because I actually have an extension in the paper where I look at non-Brownian shocks with a jump risk. Mm-hmm. Now with jump risk, it turns out that the classical risk shifting results still holds.
I see.
So at least like when it comes to continuous time, it's really crucial that you have small frequent shocks and you move continuously towards default. Now, I don't know if you start with discrete time, if at some point you end up, as you get close to the default threshold, you might end up in a situation in which it's you're back to like almost like a static model again. Mm-hmm. I don't know, maybe. So my answer is I'm not entirely sure. It looks like there's something special about the continuous time in this result, but I can see how some intuition of it might carry also to discrete time models.
Yeah, Sure, it will. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Stefano, I have the one question. I know.
Sure.
So there is this huge debate about corporations and CEOs having this golden parachute, you know, that even if they fail and if they drive the company to ashes, they get a huge bonus at the end of the contract. Do you think your model on the leverage part could be used to help that? So imagine I give the manager an outside option, a termination payment, you know, fix some size. Yeah. Will it motivate him to take the risk the shareholders would like, you think?
In a sense, you could like make default so attractive to the manager that he wishes to default. In a sense,
yeah, I don't want to go crazy, but
I know,
again,
I'm not sure that would be. I'm gonna say the message of the model in this case would be, well, you should try to make the manager as similar to a shareholder as possible.
Yeah,
in that case, I think, really like heavy equity-based compensation packages, like requiring the manager to have substantial stake in the firm, may to an extent reverse the result.
Okay. That will be it. So still no room for the parachute. Okay. That was me.
Yeah, thank you.
So we're only 6 minutes late, so I'm gonna share my screen and go for my presentation. Oh no, I messed it up. Are you seeing the? No, this didn't work. I need to do it again. Sorry.
You can try Control L maybe, or Command O.
Yeah. Please tell me you're seeing the slides.
Yeah, it looks good.
Good. So I already say hi. So I'm going to talk today about the selection advantage of corporate venture capitalists and welfare effects. This is some joint work with Daniel Wills from Asofondos in Colombia, and I do here at myself at the Inter-American Bank. So I'm going to bring a little bit motivation, a little bit from the policy side and from the innovation side. So open innovation is like the new paradigm in entrepreneurship, which is to move knowledge across firm borders. Forget about the big company having a Rand or Bell Laboratories having a huge lab and innovating there. Now it's about startups that come with new ideas, and these ideas go to the market, and you have IPOs, you have a lot of actors in here that the innovation is happening in a lot of tiny companies. And corporate venture capital initiatives are basically what the big corporations are trying to do to leverage what they know and to poach these new inventors. And the literature on corporate venture have found that the complementarities are critical for the success of these corporate venture funds. Basically, the literature is split in two camps, basically that the corporations know how to better use capital. So corporations actually increase the productivity of a firm, of a startup, and then you will say that getting financing from a corporate is going to increase your productivity. It's like what they call the treatment effect, or that corporations just know how to better assign capital. They just know how to pick the profitable companies because they are out there in the market. They have certain experience that know, this product is actually has a space in the market. This product you're offering is very nice, very interesting, but nobody's going to pay for it. So in that sense, that's what they call the selection effect. So we ask, what are the welfare implications of these corporate venture capital initiatives? And why do I care? Is because all governments, not only in Latin America, which is the focus of the IDB, but in the world, are trying to promote entrepreneurship and to promote these partnerships of big corporations funding a lot of small corporations, trying to push this as the way to develop, to generate growth, to generate wealth for everyone. So we're trying to think, okay, what are the possible implications of this involvement? So you come up with possible answers that are kind of, okay. First, if you bring new people to lend, you just have more lenders and you increase market competition, and that should be good. And the first paper on research and development financing by Aguirre and Tirol, which is like the seminal paper in these areas, says exactly that. If you give more bargaining power to researchers vis-a-vis investors, that is going to increase efficiency. So if your market, you have some restricted credit is not plenty, then for sure this is going to be good. Bring more people to lend money to startups, you're going to have more startups, and going to be great. Second is like the treatment effect. Okay, if you do something that increases the productivity of most startups, but more likely you're going to end up with a higher surplus per startup, and that's going to increase welfare just because there's going to be more to it for everyone. So what we want to do is say, okay, but what happens if the only advantage of CVCs is selection? Then the welfare effect is not direct. So if I am better at selecting the good startups, probably I'm gonna be just getting the top. I can do cream skimming, is very likely. But probably my net effect, welfare effect, is gonna be zero if everybody was getting funded, and if I'm not really improving anybody, I'm just taking the top of the top, and I'm leaving the other people to deal with the crappy ones. So that's what we're going to try to do in this paper. So, okay, what happens if corporations are only better at selection, and there is type competition among financiers? So it's not that these guys were lacking any venture capitalists. So why only selection advantage? Again, going to the data to Josh Lerner and Landa in the Journal of Economic Perspective. So in the venture capitalist arena, competition has increased a lot because there are a lot of new actors like angel investors, incubators, and private equity firms that are getting into early stage entrepreneurship financing. But also, these guys are going for younger and more startups, each of them. So they start financing companies in an earlier stage, which means less money per unit. And they're financing a lot, and this is what they call the spray and pray approach. So that makes us confident that, okay, it's not a lack of financing. It's not a lack of intermediaries, of people willing to finance. The other thing is that it's very hard to distinguish in the venture capital arena between the treatment and selection effect, because whenever you try to measure this or do some econometrics, you know that all the hidden qualities of entrepreneurship that are going to make the adverse selection problem that we're going to look at afterward, they also pose a challenge for the econometrician, because an econometrician, when you try to identify to say, is this fund actually improving companies or is just selecting better? Well, selecting is very endogenous to everything you can see. As an econometrician, the venture capitalist probably could see, but the venture capitalist saw a lot of soft skills during in-person interaction that is no way you can see as an econometrician. So you always have this thing here. However, there are ways to help to get rid of that. Basically, Brin et al. At a survey of venture capitalists, they have detailed some of them. But for corporate venture capital, it's even harder. Because, venture capitalists are out there. Venture capital is the standard guy that goes and finds it. But the corporations have two issues. First, that the profits of the corporation, the balance sheet is bigger, a lot of things are going on, and part of the profit is realized on the corporation balance sheet. So maybe Google is start investing in Google Nest, the company, and they bought the company and they integrated. But somehow you realize that part of the profits that this company accrues to Google accrue because they get the information of what the customers for Nest are doing, and they can sell some other things, or they can learn some other characteristic of that household, and they sell more advertising pointed to that household, for example. That is never going to show up in the data about Nest or the small company, but then you have that. And the other thing is that we need an advantage of corporate venture capitalists over private venture capitalists, because if they are the same as private venture capitalists, then there is no no need to do that. So what do we do here is, well, we're trying to think about the modern venture environment to answer the question about the welfare implications of corporate venture capital, because as I say, this advantage is going to interact with all these features of the venture capital environment. Like, so when I'm going to mention some: limit liability, competition, and adverse selection. Moral hazard is also present. And number 5, we have synergies and externalities. So in a previous paper, we developed an environment with features 1, 2, 3, with a unique optimal contracting venture capitalist equilibrium. This framework is going to have an extensive margin inefficiency, like too many projects are going to be enacted, and I'm going to show you later. So, and this is going to leave room some potential gains from the intervention, from putting corporate venture capitals here. I'm not going to be talking about moral hazard. There's a similar paper by Hellman and some literature thereafter. And synergies and externalities, I don't think we are working also on an extension of this paper as well, but I won't have time to talk about that today. So preview results, we're gonna put a signal in this gonna split market. So corporates are better at selecting, so they're gonna try to cherry pick, and we're gonna make the signal such as they just don't get Mark Zuckerberg and go away. They have to still face up a lot of uncertainty. We're still gonna have social inefficient projects financing equilibrium, and this inclusion of corporate venture capitalists with information advantage could reduce welfare, even if the advantage is small and high quality entrepreneurs are scarce. So, and more into it next. In the interest of time, I'm gonna skip the literature that most of you here know of financial contracts. The other 2 points are more about private venture capital and the selection effects of corporate ventures. So this is the framework I'm gonna have. I have a continuum of entrepreneurs with an idea of quality data. And we're gonna see that the probability of success is data times FK, where K is invested capital and FK is your increasing and concave function as always. And let's put in other conditions. So f of K is 0 and the derivative is infinity at 0. The entrepreneurs are gonna have no assets and gonna need to borrow the capital. A successful venture is gonna yield pi, and this is gonna be just the profits of the market they're gonna capture, or the value of the invention in the real world. And these guys are gonna have an outside option W. Basically, entrepreneur could just go work for Google and earn a wage. So far, we're gonna have 2 types of lender: the corporations, the corporate venture capitalists, and the private venture capitalists. They are the same at that they obtain capital at a gross rate of. They are not gonna be able to observe the type of the firm, but they know the distribution, and they're gonna offer contract venues. So what is a contract here? It's something that's gonna specify the investment amount, a base transfer to the entrepreneur, and a success bonus. I'm gonna impose limited liability, which means that the base transfer has to be positive, and well, also that the base transfer plus the bonus has to be greater than 0. It's not that you can squeeze. You could totally squeeze him, but it's impossible to make entrepreneur pay you extra when the company is successful. But the one that's going to be binding is this one. So that one that I just mentioned, if you forget that I just mentioned 2 lenders, but I never told you what is the difference between them. So imagine they are the same. That's the Hernandez-Wills framework that we had before. And I'm going to show you in this slide what happens in that paper. So you can define the expected gross surplus for a type data project, which imagine the full information, which is just what is the maximum you can do if you're type data? Well, you choose the capital that maximizes the surplus minus the cost. And that is the capital of full information, and that will be the surplus of this project. Well, now we go to the adverse selection problems. If I'm an entrepreneur, what is my expected utility over a contract menu? Well, I just pick the contract, the KCX that maximizes my expected return, you know, where I just get the C bonus if successful, and then get the base pay or the base transfer. So, and this is gonna be a tale of two envelope conditions. The envelope condition here on the surplus will tell you that the surplus grows at the rate f of k times pi. And since f of k is increasing and concave, you know, this k is gonna be, this k of full information is gonna be increasing in theta, and this thing is gonna be convex, then f of k times pi is gonna be convex. Now, here, the expected utility of entrepreneur is gonna be, the envelope condition says that the u prime of theta, because of adverse selection, is gonna be f of k times c. So if you remember this, you can rewrite x as the utility minus theta times fkc, which is the utility minus theta times the derivative of the utility, and this has to be positive. So all this says is that limited liability is gonna constrain the incentive steepness. So what do we find there is that all projects are financed at the efficient scale. Financial intermediaries make zero profit on aggregate, but we're gonna have contractor subsidization, and this limited liability is always gonna bind. So what's gonna happen? The steepness is constrained. So this straight line is the contract line, basically. And this curved line is the surplus line. So in the end, you're gonna have some projects here that are profitable for the intermediaries, some projects here that yield losses to the intermediaries, and some projects here below in this triangle is gonna point to the inefficient, socially inefficient projects. So a project here is weird. You know, the intermediaries are losing money. They're offering this expected utility and they're getting only this surplus. Here is better. They're offering this expected utility and getting this surplus. But here, this project, enacting this project is wasting resources for the economy because these guys should be working for W. Whatever happens here is just a transfer between private agents, but all these projects should be enacted. Our problem is all these projects that shouldn't be enacted. That's the standard framework. Now let's put the selection advantage. So how do we do it? Well, the way we like to do this in the adverse selection literature, we put a signal, and for simplicity, it's gonna be low or high that only corporates see. And it's gonna split the market into two distributions. And if you get the high signal, your distribution is better than the distribution condition on the log signal in the monoton likelihood ratio property. You know, private venture capitalists are not gonna see. So what happens here? Well, there's gonna be a market for high signal and a market for low signal. The corporates are gonna post two different type of contract menus, one for each market. The privates cannot do that. They're only gonna post one schedule tailored to the low market. So the high signal startups will only get financing from corporations. And this is consistent with the literature on the fancier venture capitalist curve like Y2 Combinator, which is from Google, or Amazon Ventures financing better startups, and they're claiming they have an effect on improving them. It's just the signal value of being financed by one of the big guys. It signals that you're good, and that's probably it. Again, we will have zero profit by sub-market, but intra-market cross-subsidization. So if we call theta XL the lowest type of entrepreneur that will accept the contract in a given market, we can also rank the lowest type of entrepreneur that is gonna accept the contract. So here, this was the lowest type in the in this market, in the private venture capital equilibrium. And now we go here, we have two different values, so two different submarkets. In the high signal submarket, there is the UH, which is the utility curve offered by the corporates, and the UL is the utility curve offered by the private venture capitals. Is going to be strictly below, which these guys cannot match this without incurring into losses. So all the high signal types are going to contract here. And this is on a, and of course, low signal cannot mask, cannot pretend to be this one. So it's a separate submarket. And this is the low signal submarket where, well, all of them are going to be offering this contract. This is the only contract curve that is going to be available for the low signal types. And again, you're going to have efficient and some inefficient projects. Here you look like, oh, this triangle is way bigger than this, but remember that actually these areas should be weighted by the conditional distribution, no? So in the high signal submarket, there is a lot of people here and very few people here. In this market, there is few people here and a lot of people. So to conclude, because I'm out of time, let's talk about how to answer the question. The problem is we cannot prove if this is going to be welfare enhancing. So first we did a simple exercise. So imagine the conditional distribution is the blue, which is a mixture of the red and the green, 3/4, 1/4, and this is very simple, and this satisfies monotone likelihood property. So let's see what happens when I put a signal like this. So the signal splits the blue between the green and the red. So let me read this from the bottom. So the efficient outcome, what will be the efficient outcome? Will be just two finance guys from here, the socially efficient, from here to the top. And I'm gonna use this as a reference. In this case, the lowest type should be 0.62. But when there are only private venture capitalists, the lowest type is 0.52. And the surplus is only 90% of what we should get. So the inefficiency is around 9%. If the corporate venture capitalists enter, now the lowest type for the high signal is 0.5, which is below this. And for the low signal is 0.55, which is higher than this. And the inefficiencies in the end add up to only 7.3%. So you get some welfare gain. And this is going to be the general case. I was happy when I saw this and spent some time trying to prove that this has to be always the case, but unfortunately it has. But this is a weird case, very special distributions, not as fancy as the one you saw, and very particular, where introducing the CVCs actually reduces welfare. So inefficiency here, total inefficiency is 34.7%, and here it was 33.8. What happened here? Well, the lowest type was 0.28. The venture capitalist outcome was close to efficient, was 0.2792. So the data was really close, but the surplus was really low. So what's happening? This is a setup where a lot of data are just below the efficient. And the good ones are really scarce. So just by including this 0.008 of data, you lost 1/3 of the surplus because there's a lot of guys there burning resources. And when you do this, when you include the corporate venture capital, it goes even worse. So that's why I couldn't prove it. So just to finish, here markets are going to react strongly to new pieces of information, because they're going to split. This is consistent with findings in the literature of venture capitalists, like Bernstein and Cow, who found that even small news or small pieces of information about a startup are going to affect their lifetime earnings or cycle. Having corporations with informational advantage will generally lower the weighted relative inefficiency, but it could be detrimental. And this is very worrisome for us because we are pushing a lot of governments and nonprofits to help to include more signals. And remember that a monotone likelihood ratio property, dominant signal is a very strong signal. If I use a crappier signal, I could do way worse. I could try to separate the guys in the middle, so I get a lot of very good and really bad, and I could generate way worse equilibriums than this one. So I was starting from a very nice signal. And this is easy to generalize to multiple signals. So maybe you need a credit score that is from 350 to 850. Maybe you just need 5 buckets or 6 buckets. Is not the same thing applies. It's not true that having more scores is gonna help you. And yeah, I knew we didn't have time for the synergies, and so that's it. I'm gonna conclude because we're just out of time. I'm happy to take the first question. Who has the first question? Miguel, I see. Please unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you.
Hey.
Very interesting. I was wondering one thing. It's about the possibility of sort of sniping the corporate venture capitalist. I mean, if you're a private venture capitalist, it might be that you observe that Google or Amazon or whatever approaches an entrepreneur, and then based on that information, you can sort of steal that information by saying, okay, I don't observe the signal, but observing the fact that Google approached you, I can now guess that the signal is high, and maybe then try to snatch it by offering a slightly better contract. And might be interesting. I don't know where it works, but for example, I was doing the analogy with the job market, in which usually you have to have, but it's sort of standard to tell other the departments that you have offers from a given department, that you have offers from another place.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that might be interesting, or whether it is observed. Maybe it's not standard in the industry, but I was wondering if that could be an interesting avenue for research.
What I know is that in the industry that doesn't happen like that, in the sense that some of these offers are on a handshake basis, and once you have the offer, that person has any other offer you receive after that, in principle, you have the other guy is already vested and cannot be diluted. So there are some contract issues there. More from the theory side, what I say is that so that this environment I presented you here is generic in the sense of, I know there is a paper by Morton Stoll where they basically generalize agent principle with when you have multiple principals, because one of the things when we have multiple principals would be like, me as a principal, I want the agent to lie to the other principal, or I want the agent to reveal something from the other principal. So they extend the revelation principle basically, and decide that everything collapses to a game where a principal post contracts, and then the entrepreneur decides. So in that sense, every signaling game or chip talk game what you could imagine will have like an equilibrium, Nash or perfect Bayes Nash, or I don't know, whatever signaling equilibrium, and it could be mapped to one of these games. So also from that side, if in equilibrium, Google thinks somebody's gonna snatch the offers they're gonna make, they're gonna design the way they do the offers such that nobody can snatch them, or they're gonna have a lot of guys. So those will be my two answers to that. But for sure, what I know this happens is that once these guys get the investment from Google, they announce it and they post it and they make sure everybody knows, like, Google invested in me. And then there is gonna be another round. So they also lever on that to get more money further down the road.
Interesting, thank you. Now I was wondering whether maybe you can even have like a sort of a winner's curse in that sense, in which the venture capitalist gets like too much hype and gets in the end a project that is not worth the money. So
well, in this environment, they're gonna make zero profit in the end. So these guys are losing a lot of money with a lot of crappy guys. Because competition, that's something that I didn't have time to go deep into it, but competition is what makes them go way to the top, put the most steep incentives possible, and then in the end, they're gonna make zero profit, or they're gonna break even basically. So they're gonna be losing with a lot of money, with a lot of guys. And that's what generates also the inefficiency. They want to fight for the best, you need to lose a lot with the rest. Okay.
thank you very much.
So I think this is it for us. I think we're 5 minutes over time. I see the chat, but thank you all you for staying, and happy to answer questions over email.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you, Juan, for the wonderful being the chair job.
Okay,
Thank you
and
very much.
good luck to
Yes,
those
good luck
going
with
on the market.
Yeah,
I'm on the buyer side, so maybe I'll see your CVs are floating around.
Thanks.